Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs talks about the volatile swings of cattle prices. Mike Apley outlines the Veterinary Feed Directive. Charlie Wortmann talks about nitrogen loss in crop production. And Brad Lubben discusses ag's importance in the presidential election. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. Consumers at the grocery store are being met with some of the cheapest beef in more than a year. The average price for all fresh retail beef and the cost of ground beef fell in December to the lowest mark in 16 months. January's Cattle on Feed report totaled the number of animals in feedlots slightly below a year ago, but indicated producers were continuing to place heavier feeders. The January cattle report, released after this taping, will reveal estimates on the size of the U.S. herd. If farmers and ranchers have indeed significantly ramped up expansion, it'll show in the cow inventory number. The category on January 1st has been higher than the previous July only twice in the 43-year history of the data, in 1974 and in 1980. We talked with Mike Wednesday afternoon and started by asking about the volatility cattle markets have recently experienced.
You've had a lot of volatility because you kind of got the market in a transition period. We've gone from a situation of low supply to an area of where we had a large supply of beef, not necessarily a large supply of cattle. There's two different things there. And now you're going to transition into less cattle and probably less beef because the winter has been so severe, it's taken a lot of pounds off these cattle.
So it gets less volatile then?
Probably not. That's a great question. The volatility is kind of here to stay because as long as we're going to let money managers and funds kind of have their free reign, they don't make money unless the market moves, and I really believe there's an effect there. Plus, you've got this market making a large transition.
Have those expanded trading limits helped impact that volatility?
I think absolutely, because once you force more than 3 contracts at limit, the next day those limits go up from $3 a hundred to $4.50, and if the funds determine that that's where they want to go, it seems to want to go there. You know, it was just last week we were limit down, limit up. You know, you had a range in cattle in 3 days that was just ridiculous. Cattle don't change value of $100 a head in 3 days unless there's an outside event, which once again there was not.
Have losses continued in the feedlot?
Losses are tremendous, and losses are going to continue because all these cattle were purchased at too high of a price. We've made them too big and put more beef on the market with less cattle than we did last year. And now even though prices are coming down and it's much better for the consumer, we chased a lot of them off last year and they're slow to come back.
What are we looking at per head losses?
Average loss for November was $500 a head. Average loss for December was $600 to $700 a head. So there are tremendous amounts of capital fleeing the industry.
All right, Cattle on Feed was last Friday. Any surprises there?
Yeah, a little bit of disappointment in that the placement number was so big because we haven't seen the sale barn receipts be all that great, and yet we had placements 5% over the guess. So that's a little discouraging. So therefore your on feed was a little discouraging because it was higher than a lot of people guessed. Now our marketings were kind of right in there, so that was good. I think as we go forward, well, once again, we're transitioning, so there's a lot of things going on right now.
I want to talk again about the big cattle coming in. The biggest group, over 800 pounds in the latest cattle on feed report, was up 10%. Why does that remain so high?
Because so many cattle are outside the feed yard. A lot of ranchers didn't want to sell for those depressed prices in the fall and said, I'll keep them and I'll wean them and I'll feed them. And they fed them up to where they would market them at around that 800, 850 pounds. And so they're coming to market that way. Those guys are trying to dig themselves out of a hole, but I'm afraid they just dug themselves a bigger one.
At a certain point in the year, does that start coming down?
I don't think it will this year. You're just going to have these big backgrounded cattle all the way into the spring, and I just think that's the way it's going to be. So then conversely, you'll have a bigger animal going out.
Are you noticing any more heifers being placed in the feedlot, indicating expansion one way or the other?
I have not, but I personally, we typically do not buy heifers because I think they're terribly unpredictable, especially in these kind of conditions. So we don't buy a lot of heifers, so I don't see a lot of heifers anyway. We run 80–85% steers around here, so I don't see a lot of heifers anyway.
Have you noticed any impact from the cheaper beef in the grocery store?
I think demand is better. I think it will build as we go into spring because I don't foresee prices getting way out of hand. But have we seen anything miraculous yet? No. It's going to take a while. We chased a lot of people off with those really, really high beef prices, and it's going to take a little bit for them to come back because your competing meats are still so cheap.
What's your hope for cattle exports, or beef exports more appropriately, this year?
I would like to see them pick up, but I still think it's going to be a struggle as long as that dollar is so strong, and I don't really profess to know what's going to change that. You need to see other economies around the world get better, and I don't know that that's going to be the case. But hopefully, at least now that prices have come down and stabilized, you know, a lot of volatility doesn't help that either. So if we get our prices to stabilize, I think you can see a little better beef demand.
Not asking this to be smart, but what's this winter been like, knowing that we could have another storm around this area of the country next week?
It's been really tough. I guess this is the third wettest winter on record. I feel so fortunate now. I've lived through two of those, 83 and now.
But so tough that you don't need a coat, so really.
Yeah, hard. Anyway, it's been really tough, and I think it's going to continue. We've had mud ever since October. It's not going to go away. These cattle are muddy, they're tired, they're cold. It's going to be 50 on Friday, and I think Tuesday we have a giant blizzard coming. That is so hard on these poor cattle, and there's not a darn thing we can do about it. Probably the one and only good thing is it's going to take pounds off the market, so there's going to be less beef out there, so hopefully that helps us.
Next week, we'll look at corn and soybean markets as we enter February. The Veterinary Feed Directive, or VFD, took effect in October, but Kansas State University veterinarian Mike Apley says the big change for livestock producers won't happen until the end of this year. The VFD requires farmers and ranchers to receive authorization from their vet to use medically important antibiotics in feed and water. Mike serves as a member on the Presidential Advisory Council on Combating Antibiotic-Resistant Bacteria under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He presented on the VFD at last week's Farmers and Ranchers College near Clay Center, Nebraska. We talked with Mike at the event and started by asking, how real is the problem of antibiotic resistance?
It's real. There's resistance issues in both human and veterinary medicine with animals, and the big question is, are we a part of the human problem here on the food animal production side? And I say if the problem was this big in humans, we're this much of it. So we do have a piece, but we're by far not the main driver.
But that does mean that we're contributing to it.
I think we can be in certain foodborne pathogens, and there's other areas that are a lot less well described.
So tell me about the background of the Veterinary Feed Directive.
The Veterinary Feed Directive was passed by Congress in an attempt to try to bring more veterinary control into our feeding of drugs in the feed of food animals. The newer wrinkle has been Guidance 209 and 213, which said we're going to put all uses of medically important antibiotics in animal feed under the control of a veterinarian through the Veterinary Feed Directive. So what that did was, beyond the new Veterinary Feed Directive rule, it's bringing a lot more medically important antibiotics under that rule by changing their labels.
So what has changed right now? Do producers need to do anything differently?
The big change will come January 1, 2017. We'll be phasing in the new labels as of December of 2016. And then as of January 1, 2017, they will need to have a veterinary feed directive for such drugs in cattle as tylosin for liver abscess control, for chlorotetracycline or oxytetracycline in the feed.
And this is also a move aimed at making sure these medications are used directly for the label purpose?
Yes, and the only way a veterinarian can authorize these uses is directly according to the label, and that includes the reason they're used, the amount used, how long they're used, what feeds they're used in. So it's really important for producers to understand the veterinarian just absolutely cannot, by law, write them for any other indication.
How much more difficult do you think this makes the job for the producer? Any more difficult?
There's going to be more planning. I mean, you can't just jump in a truck, fire it up, and go get what you want to put in the feed for the calves today. But I think there is going to be, on the negative side, there's going to be a little more time involvement, and there may be some increased fees or costs in getting veterinarians involved to do this. But what I'm telling every producer audience I speak to is that if your veterinarian isn't delivering you many times more value back by helping you with your herd health decisions and treatment decisions and what you maybe are or aren't doing, you need to find another veterinarian, because I can't help but believe that any money spent on that BCPR required to get that VFD, I can't help but believe that won't come back in spades if you choose a good veterinarian to interact with.
How much more work is it for the veterinarian?
It's going to be a lot because they're going to be authorizing a lot of these drugs. About 70% of what's sold for food animal use in the United States would go through the feed, and about another 24% through the water. So it's a lot. It's going to be a lot of work.
You mentioned livestock may be contributing a small part of that. Tell me what the human portion of trying to solve the problem is.
The humans are doing a lot of work. They're looking at use in hospitals, and they're looking at use in long-term care facilities, retirement homes. And they're also looking at now, especially on community-acquired use. My information is about 80% of the antibiotic use in human side would be in an outpatient setting. You or I are going into our family physician with an infection and they give us an antibiotic. So they are now starting to move out into the community to try to work with community awareness of this issue, just as we're all focusing on working in the community of food animal producers. So everyone's under scrutiny, everyone's creating guidelines and working. So while this may cause some discomfort at the start, I feel there can be a real benefit to it, and no one should go into this from the animal health side, from the food animal ag side, thinking we're being singled out as the only cause of this issue.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to more information about the Veterinary Feed Directive. In addition, Nebraska Extension will be holding the 2016 Beef Feedlot Roundtables at 3 locations in Nebraska from February 9th to the 11th. You can find the event sites and schedule of topics, which includes a discussion on the VFD, on the Market Journal homepage. The January Nebraska farmer says variable rate irrigation has been on farmers' radars for a few years now, but this month's issue says managing site-specific irrigation on a spatial level is a question that still remains. Researchers from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the Water for Food Institute are working together to develop a hybrid remote sensing model to measure evapotranspiration and simulate water balance. You can read more about the model in the January Nebraska Farmer. The Nitrogen Loss Assessment Tool, or N-LAT, from UNL can help corn and soybean farmers monitor nitrogen in crop production. We sat down with Nebraska Extension Nutrient Management Specialist Charlie Wortmann earlier this week to see how the N-LAT works, and began by asking about the purpose of the tool.
Well, let me start by saying what it is not. It is not a tool to be used every year for determining how much nitrogen you should put on, when you should put on it, etc. We have other tools for that. And it's not for use in season to try to estimate how much loss there has been to leaching, for instance. Again, we have other tools for that. What it is more for long-term planning, where you're making decisions before planting as to how much you put on, when you put it on, method of application, etc. for nitrogen. And you can then determine how much loss that you are having on average over years.
Walk me through the N-LAT tool and how a producer might be able to use it on his or her operation.
Well, it's very easy to use. You download it, it's in Excel, you enable macros, and you're ready to use it. The first thing you do is you select a county. It's got some drop-down list. with arrows, and you select the county, and maybe you select Adams County, for instance. You see some cells are gray. The gray cells are where you can type in information. And sometimes the information comes up by default, and you can leave it, such as the typical soil pH for that soil type, or if you have soil test information, you can overwrite that. You then tell it about your crops, and it's really for corn, soybean, either continuous corn or corn, soybean rotation. And if maybe you're doing with the corn, soybean rotation, you would select corn as one crop and soybean as the other crop, maybe 200 bushel corn, 40 yields of corn, and 60 for soybean. Then you drop down a little bit, and there's another drop-down list to choose the soil type. And you go there, and in our example, we selected Anselmo fine sandy loam. And it shows the values it has for pH and for organic matter. And again, you can accept these or overwrite it. If you move to the right, you tell it about irrigation. And let's select furrow irrigation, for example. And because it's furrow irrigation, typically we put on more water than we would with other means. Let's say we're putting on 16 inches on this sandy loam. And that the irrigation water has 8 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. Then we drop down a bit to where we select our fertilizers. And we're going to go to a drop-down list and select anhydrous ammonia injected. And we have a gray box there where we can enter the rate, and let's put in 220 pounds per acre nitrogen. That's all that needs to be entered for this scenario. We do have an option to enter something for manure and inhibitors, but we're not entering anything here.
So you've done the first field, then you can do more fields after that?
Right, but let's make some changes. And let's switch from furrow irrigation to pivot irrigation. And let's reduce the amount of water applied to 10 inches. And then we think we can be more efficient on nitrogen use. So with fertilizer, we're going to reduce how much we put on. For the anhydrous ammonia, let's put on 80 pounds in the spring. And then let's put on another 80 pounds as UAN, that is urea ammonium nitrate, liquid nitrogen. And with those changes, let's see what our results are. And we see our total losses are greatly reduced.
So once you've finished inputting all the data you have, you've clicked report, and what do you do with the data?
Well, you study it, and you see, first of all, do we have a problem? Are we really concerned about how much nitrogen we're losing? And much of our nitrogen loss comes from relatively little of our agricultural land. It's land that's more susceptible to loss, and where the management practices don't quite match. And much of our land does not have a great deal of loss. So you may decide, well, no change is necessary. But if you find the loss is quite high, you can try a different scenario. Look at the results and then make the decision. Should I change or should I not change?
On the Market Journal website, you can find a link to download the N-LAT and more resources on nitrogen use in crop production. Voters in Iowa are preparing to be the first in the nation to weigh in on the 2016 presidential election. The Iowa caucuses take place Monday. New Hampshire will hold the nation's first primary February 9th. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben to look at the role agriculture has played so far in the primary election, including to the east in the country's largest ethanol-producing state.
It's interesting to see how little has really been discussed about ag. It always starts in Iowa, and you always think agriculture has to be one of the hot issues, but we've had so many other topics on the plate and so much debate about who's in this race and who's not, that the fundamental questions about ag are pretty few and far between.
Does that mean that ag hasn't mattered so far?
It's debatable as to whether Iowa really matters as much as it used to. And it's debatable as to how much Iowa cares about ag when it has that contest as well. Ag still matters, sure. We saw almost every candidate sort of espouse their position on ethanol. It's been the big topic of the last few months, particularly with EPA's long-standing or long-awaited announcement. But ethanol sort of became the litmus test for, are you for ag or are you for industry or are you for government regulation? Ethanol became a testing point. But relatively few other topics in ag have been on the radar yet.
What's ethanol's role beyond the Iowa caucus?
It's unclear as to how long that remains the focal issue. Think of the first 3 debates. You go from Iowa to New Hampshire to South Carolina. We may not talk about ag again until you get into some of the spring primaries or even into the general election. So ag issues matter, but it's unclear as to how much they matter in this fairly polarized primary campaign.
One of the other topics that has got to mention is crop insurance,
Right.
because of the vote towards the end of last year. Tell me
Right.
what role it plays.
Well, crop insurance, if we look back to farm program legislation, one of the reasons we haven't talked as much about farm policy perhaps is we're not in the middle of a farm bill debate. But yet crop insurance, we know when the next farm bill debate comes around, and even before then, crop insurance has become a target of political discussion. In part, large part, because it has become the biggest part of the safety net. So it's the biggest chunk of that commodity program and crop insurance title, the biggest chunk of the safety net to talk about. So crop insurance as a target, it becomes something of a litmus test of how much are you for a government role or for less government.
With TPP now sort of at the front of the plate here, how much should trade be a focus for agriculture?
Trade has to be a huge focus for ag. Clearly the trade debate is not just about ag, and ag's a relatively, you might say in the end, ag might be a small part of the overall debate on whether TPP goes forward or whether candidates are for or against trade. Ag is less important to the trade battle than maybe we think, but the trade battle is clearly very important to ag. Ag can't sort of afford to divorce itself from that discussion.
And illegal immigration is one a topic that has obviously been fierily debated in the past.
Right.
And ag groups have taken a stance on it, but we
Right.
haven't heard much about it in the primary.
Well, we haven't heard much about immigration reform because it seems every attempt thus far in DC at any sort of reform has run into a stalemate. Until you can sort out primary voters that have arguably taken more polarized positions on the issue, until you can sort out who your candidates really are, it's kind of hard to imagine that any sort of middle ground reform is even possible. In some sense, that's true on almost all of these issues. The primary campaign is where you tend to find more polarized discussion between the parties and frankly even amongst candidates within each party. Once you settle on a candidate, then those candidates start to craft positions that are more attuned to the mainstream.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension Associate State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week here in Nebraska, we did see a frontal system move through the state on Monday that did drop some locally moderate snowfall across portions of east central and southeast Nebraska. Highest totals were in the area of 3 to 4 inches, about 2/10 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch of liquid equivalent. So it was a wetter snow. And then we've seen a gradual warming trend that moved from western Nebraska and started pushing eastward. Now, as we go through this weekend, we're still going to see some warm temperatures, although temperatures will start to cool as we get into Sunday. But more importantly, our attention is turning to a very aggressive storm pattern starting to move in from the western United States that has the potential to drop significant snowfall across Nebraska, particularly the southern half of the state and northern Kansas. So let's get right to it and look at the upper air models and see what we have in store. Here's the main troughing pattern that's starting to develop across the western United States. The lead wave that will be coming out this afternoon and into tomorrow will probably impact more of the panhandle. As we go through the overnight hours into tomorrow morning, we'll start to see some precipitation trying to break out in the panhandle, very light. But as the day progresses, we could see those totals start to jump up around the 1/4 inch range for the event, which would indicate that with it being snow, we might have an inch or two of snowfall possible. But more importantly, as we get into Sunday, that first system moves toward the Great Lakes and we turn our attention to the main upper air low that's going to start pushing its way toward the east. There will be a lull as we get into Sunday night and Monday morning before the surface low starts to develop in southeast Colorado. And so as we get into Monday, we'll start to see the system taking place, and the low at southeast Colorado will mean that we'll have some progressive upslope flow developing in eastern Colorado, particularly in the Denver metropolitan area, northeastern Colorado, and some of that spreading into southwestern Nebraska as we get into the latter half of the day, and then strengthening and moving toward the northeast as we get to the overnight hours, such that as we get into Tuesday, the main upper air low will be parked just to the east of Nebraska, generating a very strong gradient of winds and the quantitative precipitation forecast for the storm system paints at least a ½ inch of moisture from essentially the southwestern corner of the state up towards Sioux City. And as you progress toward the southeast, precipitation totals jump up into the 1 1/4 inch range, which would signify a 10-to-1 ratio, about a foot of snowfall. So keep an eye on the weather, because this is a rapidly evolving situation. The model's been painting this picture for 2 weeks now, and it's been holding steady in the same exact track. So this is a very dangerous storm with the potential to really cause a lot of heartache across a good portion of the center part of the country. It's just a matter of, is it going to hit all right over Nebraska, or is it going to paint some of the northern portions of Kansas? Now, as we get into Wednesday, we see the main energy move well toward the Great Lakes, and we get this northerly flow, so the cool air will be coming in behind this front, so we are going to be below normal in terms of temperatures. And as we get into Thursday, we start to see the main pivot of this trough moving eastward, so ridging pattern starts to take place in the western United States, bringing some warming temperatures to extreme western Nebraska, but we still have another piece of energy moving into this northerly flow through the central plains that should impact central portions of North Dakota all the way into eastern Nebraska, with a potential for a couple more inches of snowfall. And then as we get into Friday, we see the ridge trying to come into our region, but yet another wave may make its way down through our region as we get into Saturday. So now as we look at the 8 to 14 day forecast, we see as that trough moves toward the east, and this is from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, the trough moves east, pushing the cold air to our east, and we see the warm air starting to build into the west. And in terms of precipitation, with that ridge building in, we're going to see a lack of precipitation across the southern half of the United States. Now as we look at the new forecast for February through April in terms of precipitation, we see well above normal precipitation across a good portion of the southern and central plains. And in terms of this summer, which takes us through May through July, we see a second consecutive month of below normal precipitation painted for the eastern Corn Belt.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, the Veterinary Feed Directive, nitrogen loss in crop production, and the importance of agriculture in the presidential election. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, we'll look at corn and soybean markets, and Dave Aiken will discuss loan subordination. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.